Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final legislative preview event. I'm really excited to be here with my friend Keith Phaneuf. We've been talking about the state budget, I don't know, Keith, for years and years and years, and we always have some sort of interesting story to tell. I know that you've got a lot of questions for us, and as we start, I do want to remind you, maybe you've done this before with us, but if you haven't, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A function, and you just click that and you can add your questions. What we're going to try to do throughout the course of this hour is get to as many of your questions as we can. At the very end, some of the questions that you don't get to or that we don't get to, we'll try to add into a lightning round. And of course, you can always continue our conversation on Twitter. Keith is at CTMirror Keith, and he loves to interact with people on Twitter with their budget questions. So before we get to any of your questions, I just want to welcome Keith Phaneuf. Thanks so much for doing this, Keith.
It's always a pleasure, John. I was thinking during the intro, we go back longer than I can count. I mean, it's been a long time now that we've been discussing state finances.
It really has. I think we go back as long as you were working at another newspaper, and I tried to get a space in the Capitol press room next to you.
I was going to say it's been a long trek.
It has.
And we've learned a lot.
We have, and here's what's interesting, Keith, is we've learned a lot, but as we've talked over and over again, we've almost had, in some ways, the same conversation. Connecticut's budget's in the dumper. There's some sort of problem with the budget. Right now, there's actually some rosy news. And I know that in about a few minutes, you're going to throw some cold water on this. You're going to say, here's why this isn't such great news. But for the first couple of minutes, why don't we just talk about how things are actually, in some ways, doing a lot better in terms of the Connecticut state budget than they have been in a long time.
That's true. I mean, we've been enjoying for the last maybe 2.5 years, a rebound in the stock market that the previous governor, Daniel Malloy, begged and prayed for, and it basically arrived just as he was walking out the door. Governor Lamont's sort of been the beneficiary of that. But the portion of our state income tax that's tied to capital gains and dividends has been booming. And as a result of largely of that, we have amassed over the last 2.5 years a rainy day fund of a little more than $3 billion, which is, by the way, the largest amount allowable by state law. It's equal to about 15% of the general fund. That's the cap. The other potential good news is the new president, President Biden, has proposed a very huge stimulus package, but specifically I'm going to focus on, there's a $350 billion component of flexible money for states and municipal governments. And the old rule of thumb in Connecticut, because of our wealth, we generally get a smaller share than other states. We get about 1%. So if you're doing the quick back of the envelope math, if, and I want to stress if that passes, that's another $3.5 billion, $6.5 billion of one-time money. That's the good news.
Okay, so that's the good news. And before we get off the good news just now, obviously the stock market's been performing well. A couple of weird days for the stock market. We won't get into that over the course of the last week, but we don't know that Biden stimulus money is coming through, that big chunk that he's hoping to get to the states will actually be there. If that doesn't happen, you're saying this is still a better position than Governor Lamont could have ever really thought he'd find himself in right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we are looking at, we do our state budgeting in 2-year cycles. And we're saying if we don't make any adjustments, state finances are on pace to run about $2.6 billion in the red over the next 2 years combined, about $1.3 billion a year. Sorry for all the numbers. It's about 8%. And you might say, well, wait a minute, where was all that money you're talking about? The reason our regular budget, before we get into this one-time money, is still faced with problems is because, and stuff John and I have been talking about for more than a decade, Connecticut has a huge legacy of debt. Almost 30% of our budget goes to pay off that debt. We're talking pension debt, bonded debt, and the like. But let's stay for a minute on the good news. And that does feel a little weird for me to say that. Um, you have even just what we already know Connecticut has in the bank, $3 billion in the rainy day fund. Remember, I said if you don't make any changes to the budget, you've got about $2.6 billion of potential holes. In other words, we have enough to keep the current state budget afloat for 2 years if we want to buy some time for the overall economy, not just Wall Street, to improve. And I'm glad you mentioned, John, the stock market's had, a couple shaky or odd days. It does not change the fact that the Dow Jones Industrial Average is still, more than 10% higher than it was before the pandemic. In other words, the pandemic hit, stocks plunged. By the summer, we'd regained all that value, and then we've built upon it. So, it's all Governor Lamont is correct when he says, don't be a day trader. You can't just look at 1 or 2 days of numbers. Right now, the stock market is the one thing Connecticut's economy has going for it.
Okay, so before we get to some of the bad news, I suppose, let's talk a little bit more about what this good news means for Governor Lamont. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, but yet somehow he finds himself in a position where the state is flush with cash. We've got this rainy day fund. We've maybe got more money coming from the federal government. What does this mean for the governor and his ability to do some of the things that he wants to do, some of the things that he might need to do if he wants to run for reelection and get reelected? Talk about what you think this means specifically for this governor.
Yeah, that to me is the big issue for this entire budget. Short-term good news meets a time-sensitive problem. And that has been the issue basically since the summer, since it was clear by July that the stock market had rebounded and Connecticut's short-term budget problems weren't going to be that severe. But again, when we eventually get to the really, the pension debt, the fact that we have $90 billion in long-term debt, $3 billion in the bank is a drop in the bucket against what we owe and will pay over the next 30 years. The question then becomes, should we be socking every penny away so that there's another smooth state election cycle, or do we need to put more money into nursing homes, small businesses that are about to close, nonprofit social services, cities and towns that are out hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue? And if we say, well, let's get to the next election first, the problem is businesses are closing, people are getting sick, and some people are dying.
I think a lot of people in Governor Lamont's camp, though, would say that that's a awfully cynical way to look at things. It's not just about the election, of course. He has said time and time again, he doesn't really want to touch this rainy day fund that the state has built up because he's seen rainy days in the past. He wants to make sure that we're actually shored up before we start spending once again. But the argument you seem to be making, Keith, and I know an awful lot of advocates who say that the state has been too stingy are making, is that this really was a time-sensitive problem. And the fact that the state didn't want to expend more money during this time actually is costing people big time.
Well, no matter how well you take care of your car, if you don't ever drive it out of the garage, it doesn't really serve a purpose. I know there's an old saying that says order without flexibility is no better than chaos. You have a rainy day fund for a reason. And the argument has been, if the pandemic is not a rainy day, if that is not a time-sensitive problem, what is? The argument that has been given by the Lamont administration since the spring is, we could be looking at a huge fiscal mess. And if you'll indulge me, just one more example, going back to the numbers.
Sure.
Back in late April and early May, Governor Lamont, and I would argue through no fault of his administration, thought the problem we're staring at now, this $2.6 billion, was going to be probably double that size. And he also thought by now the rainy day fund would be zero. Sometime between May and now, a whole heck of a lot changed. Zero turned into $3 billion in the bank. $5 to $6 billion of potential holes became closer to 2.5. But my point is, we didn't just discover that yesterday. Things started to become clear in the fall, by September, and then again in October. And the legislature were in for special sessions, and nobody wanted to talk about the improving revenues. And Connecticut has been slowly but surely acknowledging that. And at the same time, we're getting this good news in the stock market. We're seeing that we still have 190,000 people collecting weekly unemployment benefits. To give you some perspective, we lost 120,000 jobs in what we call the Great Recession of 2007 through 2009. We know that the entire hospitality industry is still fragile. We know that cities and towns are out again hundreds of millions of dollars. Many of them, there was a new report out that shows, basically borrowed to try to stave off property tax increases. So in other words, there are a lot of segments of our economy, and the comptroller, Kevin Lembo, has really been pointing to this, calling it a K-shaped recovery, while one part is, so I can do this the right way, going up, another part's going down. Those are all the letters I'm going to spell out. That's a real issue. And that time-sensitive problem has kind of been put on ice. We haven't been really dealing with it as a state, or many would argue that.
What would the state do to deal with those issues? I mean, how might the state actually spend down some of its good fortune at the moment to make a big impact for people as they're hurting now?
There are as many ideas out there, hopefully, as we have people listening today, but just to give you some of the ones that people have been really pushing for. You're going to see a proposal tomorrow from the leaders of the Appropriations Committee to seriously beef up funding for the private nonprofit, the community-based agencies that provide the overwhelming bulk of the social services in this state. We already have a proposal from the top Democrat in the state Senate, Martin Looney, to increase two municipal grant programs that reimburse communities for property they can't tax, state land, colleges, and hospitals. This is really a problem in the cities. This is what pushed Hartford to the brink of bankruptcy. The legislature is in a position to do that now. I think there were people who wanted to do things like that months ago. And just very quickly, the nursing home industry asked over the summer for an extra $300 million a year. It's not easy to take that out of state money, but it's also, there is a way legally where we could have done it. I mean, the hospital industry still has not recouped close to what it's lost. We have more problems than we have dollars, but we still have a lot of dollars that we could have put towards some of those dollars toward those problems.
So we'll come back to some of that in just a moment. I want to just dig in a little bit more to our continuing tale, our decade-long tale of bad news. You talk about the long-term obligations, and you skimmed the surface a little bit about it. Some people who follow the state budget very, very closely know some of these numbers and know the deal. But this is something that the reason we talk about all the time is because it's really important to understand just how underwater the state has been for such a long time. Maybe you can put into some context exactly what it means to have that much of the state's budget going toward debt service, what it means to have $92 billion in long-term obligations, just so people can get a little better sense of what we're dealing with here.
Right. I think my favorite analogy on this that I try to use is crabgrass in the backyard. If you think of the state budget as just a rectangular fenced-in backyard, and the backyard is filled with everything you like. Maybe you've got too much stuff crammed in it. You've got a picnic table, you've got a kids wading pool, and maybe you've got a trampoline, you've got a gym set, you've got all these things, and I'm trying to make them represent things we care about, like transportation and healthcare. But there's also some crabgrass in the backyard. And just go with me on this. Wherever there's crabgrass, you can't have anything else. And as the crabgrass spreads, which by the way is our debt payments, you start throwing things over the fence. It's like all of a sudden, oh, we can't keep the trampoline in here anymore because there's no room for it. This, in many states, can represent 20% of the budget, even less. In Connecticut, it was pushing more than 33%, and we've already refinanced some of it and pushed it onto future generations at great cost. But what it is doing is it's leaching resources away. It's the magnet next to our budget compass. It is the reason why, when people say, why do we even have to talk about tolls with our gas taxes? Don't we have enough money? Well, for a decade, to help cover our pension costs, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars every year in gas tax money not in the transportation system. We've leached money out of the municipal aid program, which is why property taxes have gone high. Where did that money go instead? Into the pension debt. We've been taking money out of just about every priority you care about to try to clip down this crabgrass. That is a problem. And we have overall, when you look at our pension debt, our bonded debt, our retirement healthcare debt, things that we're legally committed to, and I don't care what anyone else is telling you, we have no choice but to pay. We're talking about $92 billion the state owes. Again, we have $3 billion in the rainy day fund. It's great for the short term. But the bill that we have coming due over the next, I shouldn't even say 30 years, closer to 20, is monumental.
So I think one question a lot of people have is, politics is a short-term game. The governor serves for 4 years. The legislators serve for 2.
Right.
They're constantly looking to get reelected. It's very, very hard to make decisions that are anything other than short-term, but you're talking about a very, very long-term problem. Just to continue with your crabgrass analogy, Keith, the problem with $92 billion worth of crabgrass is that that's a hole that I can't think of a way to get out of. It's like the crabgrass takes over and it grows over your whole house and you just have to move. And we're not going to do that. I mean, what do we do about that problem?
Right.
Because we can continue to talk about it being this thing that's looming over every decision that's made at the Capitol. But I don't know that we can do anything about that substantively, can we?
Yes. What we can't do is anything that's fun about it. What we have to do is reset our expectations, because now I'm going to try to give you a little something to offset it. And I'm not saying this is the only solution. I'm saying the math is saying over the next 20 to 30 years, there is no way, unless you think a federal judge is going to tell one of the wealthiest states in the nation, you don't have to pay your bill. And by the way, for the people who say, no, the rich are moving, we can't pay it. We can pay it. It's not the death of Connecticut. It may be the death of Connecticut as you know it, but it's not the death of Connecticut. We can pay that bill and we're not even going to end up being your poorest state. We're not going to be Arkansas. We're not going to be Michigan. But we are still going to be able to pay that off. Why, you might say that? Well, let me point something out. They say since the last recession, the top 1% in the United States makes 24 times what the bottom 99% average. And there are a lot of very wealthy people in the bottom 99%. In Connecticut, that ratio is 43 to 1. In Fairfield County, the ratio is almost 75 to 1. To give you an idea of also what that translates into budget choices, Westport and Bridgeport, 2 communities very close to each other. If you look at their grand list proportional to their population, in other words, how much wealth can they tax for every man, woman, and child in those respective municipalities? Westport's grand list is 10 times the size of Bridgeport's per person. For every man, woman, and child, Westport can access 10 times the wealth. Even though, if you're talking about the type of problems they have to deal with, crime, a welfare caseload, traffic, potholes, whatever you like, there are a lot fewer problems in challenges in Westport than in Bridgeport. There is wealth in Connecticut. The challenge is if we're saying, no, that's a non-starter, that can't be touched, then what you will continue to see is the crabgrass explode. And the short-term goals, that's the nature of politics, will continue to do as much as they can to put off the day of reckoning. And by the way, it's still getting closer, because the last point I'll make, John, is you hear kicking the can down the road. We're not kicking the can. Can doesn't get any bigger when you kick it. We're rolling a snowball. It gets larger and larger. Every time we slide it down the road or we refinance our pensions, we pass on billions of dollars of long-term debt to the folks who are in kindergarten right now in Connecticut.
Okay, so we've gotten to the point in our conversation where then we'll talk about taxes. Okay. Taxing that richest 1% or 0.1% here in Connecticut. That's something that, as we've talked to the governor over the course of his entire tenure, and certainly recently, he has said, I don't want to do. He told me on the podcast that he actually would like the Biden administration to do that at the federal level. And it looks as though the Biden administration is going to attempt to do something just like that. What's funny, Keith, is I actually was watching an interview on CNBC in which Elizabeth Warren was talking to one of their hosts about whether or not people would get up and leave the country if there is a marginal extra tax placed on the wealthiest 1%. We're concerned about people leaving the state. So, first question, are people leaving the state or going to leave the state because the state is going to raise taxes on the wealthiest individuals?
The data that we have, the US Census data, consistently shows that is not a factor. And I'll just give you two examples. There is one state in the nation that has increased its income every year by migration. I'm not going to say it's increased its overall income. There are a lot of factors. Did they grow jobs? Did people get raises? But if you say, okay, this state I'm thinking of, how many people moved in and what were they making? How many people moved out and what were they making? Can you guess the state that's gained income via migration every year for the last 30 years?
You know, since you asked this way, I'll say Connecticut.
No, it's that paragon of wealth, Arkansas.
Oh, of course.
Which ranks, basically competes with Mississippi for dead last in just about every poverty metric you can think about, for the simple reasons that you can expect. When you're on the bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. Every year, the odds would suggest the people moving out of Arkansas are poorer than the people who move into it. The converse is true with Connecticut, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and just about every state that ranks near the top in per capita income, and for that matter, per capita wealth. Every year, the incomes of the people who move out of Connecticut are generally higher than the incomes of the people who move into Connecticut from other states. But this rate of exodus, that you would call it, is basically the same and has been for the last 40 years, like stamping out license plates. And if you want a really good example, and this is the last point I'll make on this, in 1991, when we passed the state income tax, just before we adopted it, we already had an income tax on the books for 20 years, but it was only aimed at the wealthy. We taxed capital gains, if you made enough of them, at 7%. We taxed dividends and interest as high as 13%. When the income tax was passed, all income initially was taxed at a flat rate of 4.5%, meaning for Fairfield County, it was a massive tax cut. Massive. For the next 5 years, income migrated out of Connecticut at the exact same pace it had for the 5 years prior to that. By that logic, people should have been pouring into Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing changed. That has still basically been the story right up until now.
You talked to the governor just this week. Despite pressure coming from people on the Democratic side of the aisle, he doesn't have any interest in entertaining tax hikes on the richest Connecticut residents.
No, and I do think we should clarify, a lot of these proposals for tax hikes on the rich are, from his own party, are basically founded in a principle of revenue neutrality, meaning, okay, yes, because we have some projected deficits, people are saying, I want to raise taxes on the rich to pay for a tax cut on the middle class, to pay for more tax relief on the poor, or to pay for more property tax relief for municipalities. And look, I fall into the same trap. I say it. I asked the governor, what is your position on raising taxes on the wealthy? But a lot of these proposals are really about a form of wealth redistribution. And Governor Lamont is saying, well, I don't want to raise taxes on anyone. Therefore, because that is really the only way right now you could do it. I mean, nobody's looking, I think, to raise taxes to launch new programs in Connecticut.
But also nobody's looking,
programs.
But nobody's looking to raise taxes either to solve the long-term problem that you're talking about either.
That debate is not happening this year. That's correct.
So
no, it's just short-term. What can we do to help people who are struggling in COVID to put more dollars into certain homes? That's been the debate for this year.
So when you wrote this week about Senate President Martin Looney coming out with a plan to tax homes of richer people in the state, maybe you can explain a little bit about what is in his plan and where those dollars would go. Again, as you say, this is not money that's going to serve or solve our long-term problems.
Right. What Senator Looney proposed, he was trying to have a progressive element and stay away from the income tax because it's such a political lightning rod. And he does have another proposal which does involve income, but the one you're talking about, John, is he would create a new statewide mill rate of 1%. However, the first $300,000 of assessed value on your house would be exempt. Now, keep in mind, the assessed value of your house is equal to 70% of its market value. So if you're saying, well, what house is going to get hit? Your house would have to be, you'd have to be able to sell it for more than $430,000 before you owe anything. And the thinking is being that if Governor Lamont says, well, if we raise taxes on the rich, they'll flee the state. Senator Looney saying, well, unless they're going to find some way to deconstruct their house and haul it away with them, they're going to have to sell their house to someone else who's going to come into Connecticut. So if we tax the house, we keep the wealth in Connecticut. And the goal would be to turn around, take that money and funnel it back into communities with the high poverty levels.
Does that have a chance of passing?
I think Governor Lamont, I don't think, first of all, the Republican minority in the House or the Senate would support it. I don't think Governor Lamont, I mean, he's pretty much drawn a line in the sand. I think his own party is trying to force a debate because Governor Lamont has certainly been very cautious. He has not said anything about running for re-election. He has not made any announcements. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of Democrats in the General Assembly expect that he's running, expect him to run again. Remember that he actually campaigned for the office in 2018 with a platform that had a huge progressive taxation proposal. I shouldn't say huge, a very significant progressive taxation proposal that he ultimately scrapped. And they're hoping that they can put some pressure on him.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this. Part of what he ran on was providing tax relief and tax cuts to poor and middle class individuals. It would have been a pretty big tax cut.
Yes.
It's something that he did not deliver on. And this is another thing that you've suggested perhaps he could have done, given the money that the state has come into because of money coming in from Wall Street.
Right. Well, when he was running in 2018, in fairness, he was running into a campaign message that was, again, not trying to take sides, just looking at the math, was empirically dubious at best. And the Republican candidate, Bob Stefanowski, had proposed phasing out the state income tax. I'm not talking about what's fair, what's right. I'm saying what does 2 + 2 add up to? The income tax raises half the money for the state budget. If you took the income tax away, the sales tax, which is our next biggest revenue engine, would basically cover the payments on the pension and the bonded debt. You get to run, you haven't even given cities and towns any money, and you got to run the rest of government, and you have to run a Medicaid program, and you have nothing else left. In other words, it just couldn't be done. And the Lamont campaign was understandably frustrated, I think, with the news media, that people were not pointing out that this person was promising something, that the math didn't come close to adding up. So they said, well, we're going to come out with a realistic tax relief plan. And it was an income tax cut for the poor and the middle class by expanding a particular credit within the state income tax, the property tax credit. Trying to analyze that, I still asked the Lamont campaign, how are you going to pay for this? Because there were some challenges that whoever was going to be governor in 2019 and 2020 faced, even without knowing the pandemic was going to happen. The point that I'm getting at is the Lamont administration said, we're convinced we're going to pay for it. We have a way to pay for it, and they showed how they were going to do it. In his first year and a half in office, the fiscal conditions did not get any worse. In fact, they got marginally better than the projections held when he made his promise. He instead found that it was harder to balance the budget than he thought. In fact, there was a proposal to tax the rich that the legislature had put forward to tax the capital gains earnings of households that made more than $500,000 a year. The Lamont administration insisted on killing that. Well, then there was no way to balance the legislature's budget unless his tax relief also went on hold. So everything went into limbo. Since then, Governor Lamont has just said, I don't believe we should be doing tax redistribution at the state level. He sincerely believes it will produce wealth exodus out of the state. He says if it should be done, it should be done at the federal level. The challenge for that is, as we talked about, Connecticut generally gets the smallest share of federal money because of our great wealth.
So some progressives in the legislature have essentially proposed tax relief that is on par with what Lamont had promised. And I'm wondering what traction you think that that's going to get, Keith, without the governor's support.
I think it's going to get a robust debate. I really do. I'm not sure beyond that because, you've already mentioned Senator Looney's proposal on the statewide property tax. He also brought back that capital gains tax I talked about. Representative Sean Scanlon from Guilford has proposed a new income tax credit based on the federal child tax credit. This would give probably about close to about $450 million a year by the time it's fully implemented to poor and middle class families. Sean did not say, oh, I'm committed only to taxing the rich, but he said, I'm not going to cut programs that people rely upon, and I'm not going to raise taxes in the poor and middle class to pay for their own tax relief. So it doesn't leave a lot of other options for where to go. That's also gotten the attention of the state employee unions, who very much remember that back in May, when the administration thought the pandemic was going to cause much more economic chaos for the state budget because they didn't know Wall Street was going to rebound, they asked the unions for concessions. A lot of people forgot, and the union said, no, we've already given 3 times in the last decade. We're not giving again. I think they're going to put a lot of pressure on him. I still think ultimately he's going to draw the line, but if I can just ramble on for one more minute,
Sure.
I think that's what's going to make, I think this year is going to set up one of the most contentious budget debates next year that we've seen in a long time. I think Governor Lamont will try to dig in and say, no, I don't want to do any tax redistribution. And no, we can't use this rainy day fund for any new programs, because he'll correctly point out it's one-time money. But it's been a long time, John. I trying to think back in my career, the last time somebody ran for governor and did not propose some form of tax relief, rebate, some other form of tax cut in their reelection year. If Governor Lamont comes out next February and tries to pay for an election year tax cut using one-time money, after telling his own party, you can't have new programs using one-time money, I think it's going to get ugly.
A lot of questions are coming in, and I'm going to start to get to those in just a second.
Sure.
Keith, maybe though we can just quickly talk about the status of some of the programs, the services that the state provides in this year of COVID. If it was a relatively good year for the stock market, it was a incredibly poor year for an awful lot of people's employment. As you said, many people still out of work, many people still collecting unemployment, hundreds and hundreds of businesses closed. But then there's any number of other social services that have been stretched to the limits, including hospitals. Paint a picture, if you would, perhaps, of just how dire it is for some of the services that the state usually provides at this point, given the pandemic.
Okay, well, you started with social services, so let's go there. The overwhelming bulk of the state social services are provided by small community-based nonprofit agencies that Connecticut contracts with. These are not, their staff are not state employees. These are agencies that long before the pandemic were facing annual turnaround rates, attrition rates of 25, 26%. Turnover rate was the word I was groping for. They're hemorrhaging millions or tens of millions of dollars. A lot of them people who work with the disabled, who work with people struggling with drug addiction. There will be day programs. Now, we tried to keep like the methadone clinics and the like going, but a lot of the day programs, especially for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, those had to stall or be pulled back during the worst of the pandemic. That cost these nonprofits far more than they saved by not. Most of them have had layoffs, have had to reduce their staffs, and they're expecting, by the way, to get a ton more business. But I don't mean in the good sense. I mean like they're going to be asked to do more with the same amount of money because We're anticipating a huge surge in state retirees. I should have also mentioned these nonprofits are basically getting paid only about 2% more than they were making a decade ago. So after you factor for inflation, they're way behind the eight ball. That's one example. How about small businesses? We had a Republican proposal for a small business bridge loan early in the pandemic. Governor Lamont did seize upon that. He offered $25 million. They doubled it almost as soon as they opened it when they realized they badly underestimated the need. They closed the entire program within 48 hours of opening it, and it maxed out. They had over $200 million in requests for $50 million in funding within 48 hours, so they just shut it down. That was the last state-funded program. So, I mean, and you still have a restaurant industry that's begging for, now they've gotten federal money, and the Lamont administration will say, we've passed all that along. But there are many who are going to say that's not enough. The nursing home industry warned that they needed another $300 million this fiscal year to stay afloat, to stay, to balance their books, to not lose money. I believe the hospital industry, I think their losses, even after you back out what the state has given them, easily exceed 500 million, or we're approaching $1 billion. Those are just some of the places where people are hurting.
And our colleague, Jacqueline Ray Thomas, and I have talked about the fact that although the state has put forward tens of millions of dollars in rental assistance to help people who couldn't pay their rent, it's about a tenth of what people actually needed to pay their rent. And of course, the landlords are stuck too, because they don't have people unable to pay rent and they're still paying their mortgages.
Now, you're right. I left out, I'm sorry, I left out rental assistance. And for that matter, I should have also mentioned higher education's getting clobbered. There's a huge question mark hanging particularly over the state university system and the community college system. What if the COVID pandemic results in a permanent shift in students' attitudes? And you might say, come on, they're young, they're all going to go back to campus. What if only 3 or 5% of the students who were living on campus decide, I like saving the money by going remote. The more I think about it, I'm going to finish my education at home, taking classes online. This is a system that since the mid-90s, to deal with that pension problem, the state has been giving them less and less money. We've been borrowing more and building new dorms and saying, here's how you run your colleges. Go out and get more students to live on campus. As it was, that system is not balancing the books, which is why tuition keeps going up and up and up. What if the number of kids on campus goes down even marginally? Mm-hmm. Now, all of a sudden, a system that's in big trouble is going to also be eroding cash, hemorrhaging cash.
All right, I've got a lot of questions to get through, and we'll try to get through as many of these quickly as possible. Let's see. Bill asks, what's the state going to do about the crumbling infrastructure? He talks about the Gold Star Bridge, et cetera. Any solutions being proposed? Do they have any chance of passing? So this was the big conversation last year. Governor Lamont didn't want to have a conversation that was all the time about tolls, but as we said earlier, the transportation system is crumbling. Bill has a question about that. What's happening with that right now, Keith?
Very little, unfortunately, but thanks for the question, Bill. Tolls, nothing is ever certain, but tolls are very, very unlikely to be brought up this year. You may see some proposals for gasoline taxes, but because we have this one-time money, what you could also see is the administration could move some money from the general fund to the special transportation fund. The other thing, unfortunately, that we're doing is we are effectively slowing down the money that we're putting into the capital program. Most of the money to build roads and bridges, fix rail lines, we borrow that. And in turn, we also get matching grants from the federal government. Well, if we go to Wall Street every 10 months, 7 months to borrow money, and then we start stretching out the time in between we borrow the same amount of money, we're slowly starving that program. And there are already signs that we're doing that to save money.
Uh, Somebody else was asking just along those lines. I don't know if you gave us a number. I mean, where are we with deficits on the Special Transportation Fund? I mean, do we understand exactly what the hole is?
What we did with the Special Transportation Fund, just to remind everyone, in 2015, Governor Malloy got the legislature to pass this ramp up program. We were going to take a portion of our sales tax receipts out of the general fund, put it in the transportation fund, and we were going to go borrow a lot more money every year. And we did. They called it, we're going to ramp up. The way that borrowing shows up in the state budget is we make payments on the principal and interest every year. And it was sort of a way to give us a little shove into tolls. In other words, we borrowed more money than we could pay off. But the thinking was, once we've incurred the debt, we'll have no choice but to pass tolls. The 5-year ramp up period ended last summer. We owe the bill. We don't have enough money to pay for it. We never passed tolls, or for that matter, any other thing. So at this pace, the Special Transportation Fund runs out of money in 2024. And that is assuming we slow down the amount of money we put into infrastructure repair by about a third.
Carlisle asks, we used to hear a good deal about the teachers' pension fund not being funded. Where is that now? And where does it look like it's going?
The teachers' pension fund is still a huge problem. 2 years ago, when Governor Lamont came into office, they said we were going to refinance it. What we did was we took some type of a holiday, I guess I would say. We took a break. We actually decided that we would pay into the pension fund about $200 million less in Governor Lamont's first 2 years than we'd paid in total than we paid under Governor Malloy. That money will be made up by kindergartners now, plus a heck of a lot of interest. And I think that will not be the last time you see the pension fund refinanced by governors. It's become the new way to roll the snowball down the hill. But it's still there. It's still massively unfunded.
Lee has a question. Does Lamont have any plans to attract businesses back to Connecticut?
I think you will see the governor roll something out. Again, the challenge is going to be the best way to get some businesses back would be to offer some type of incentives. He can do some of that with borrowing, but if he wants to do it with taxes, basically anything you give out in tax relief, you've got to get back with higher taxes from someone else. So you've got to figure out who to tax. Because he's drawn a line in the sand on that, I think he's going to have a tough time doing any major tax incentives for businesses. They may nibble around the edges, but nothing substantial.
Yeah, and I think two things I wanted to talk to you about on that. You know, the last governor spent quite a bit of time and money giving out tax incentives to get businesses to come here. Right now, in the midst of this pandemic, when so many businesses that were built here in Connecticut have closed, I guess I just wonder if tax incentives for businesses, even if they were politically palatable at the moment, would be even a starter, Keith. Is that even a way to get businesses to come here to Connecticut, given that it's really hard to start a business of any kind right now, or maybe for the next year or two?
Well, Fred Karstensen would never forgive either of us if I did not mention that. He says there is a way to do it if you structure it. I want to point out, Governor Malloy did do some tax incentives, but most of the relief he did was on the state's credit card. We borrowed most of the money that we gave out to help businesses. Governor Lamont could do that as well, but he's talked about a debt diet. Fred Karstensen, who's heads the economic think tank at UConn, has been saying the state's big problem for a long time has been its complete lack of data, its inability to take advantage of a lot of these stranded credits. Businesses in Connecticut have a lot of credits on the books that in theory, they're never going to get to tap because you can only use so much of them at one time. He's saying if we tie these to job growth pledges, that we could actually sort of use them as bait to get these industries to upload. And if we run the numbers and we invest in the right areas, it will pay for itself. But it would involve government thinking outside of the box, and generally government's never that creative.
Chris asks, how much could the expected silver tsunami of state employee retirements save annually? Any other cost reduction ideas to close the projected deficits and fund long-term liabilities in lieu of raising taxes on the wealthy or anyone?
Thanks for the question. That's a good one. Just to give people some idea, there are projections that as much as 25% of the workforce could be eligible to retire between 2022 and 2023. They're talking about 12,000 people. I don't want to say I think you'll see 12,000 people retire, nor do I think even if they did, you would see 12,000 positions left vacant. I want to have people keep in mind that the executive branch workforce went down as it is about 10% under Governor Malloy. It is a lot tighter than people realize. There are a lot of agencies that have staffing problems. Also, John, we talked about this during the Malloy administration. You don't save anywhere near as much money as you think when people retire. When they retire, they're no longer paying into the pension fund, they're drawing benefits. So the first thing that happens is your pension contributions go up. In the very first year that people leave office, when you're paying out, depending on how veteran they are, accrued sick time and vacation time and other things, many times there's very little savings. You're talking about, and I still think that the legislature is going to have a tough time not refilling these positions. Many of the unions have language in their contracts that say, you can get rid of our jobs if you're eliminating a program, if you're eliminating a service. But if you're going to privatize it, you can't do it. So a lot of these jobs are going to be refilled. I think the savings, you'd be lucky in the first year if you even saved $150 million in a $20 billion budget. We're talking a fraction of 1%.
Quickly, before we have to take a break,
Sorry.
Are there savings in state government that you can see right now when people say, well, state government just needs to run leaner. We need to figure out a way to save money and deliver the services more efficiently. Do you see ways to do that?
There are not a lot of savings in the short term because so much of our money goes into what are called fixed costs. When you're putting 30% of your budget into debt payments, and then when you're putting, say, another 10% of your budget, 15% of your budget into municipal aid, which nobody wants to cut. And then you figure out Medicaid. And by the way, we haven't even talked about payroll yet. All that's really left are social service programs, and that's not that big a portion of the budget. Good luck cutting that during the pandemic.
All right, Keith, we got just a couple minutes to go before 8 o'clock. Let's go through a lightning round of a lot more questions people have.
Okay.
Martha asks, is marijuana legalization likely to move, and isn't that a source of revenue?
There's a very good chance that it moves. Again, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And I know we've talked about a lot of numbers, but keep in mind, in a $20 billion budget, 1% is 200 million. The deficit that we're looking at is about 1.3 billion a year. Again, marijuana, maybe in the first year, 60 million, 50 million. You would take it, but it's not huge.
Jim asks a question that has come up a number of different times in various forms. So I'll ask his version of it. It says, if taxes don't matter, as you say, in decisions where businesses and residents choose to domicile, why have we lost billions of dollars in tax dollars to Texas and Florida? We lose residents to these states every year, and most of it is high net worth individuals leaving.
Yes, we lose people to Texas and Florida every single year. We've lost them when we've prospered. We've lost them when we've declined. We've lost them at the same rate. Connecticut doesn't import its millionaires, it grows them. And taxes always matter. I'm not saying they're a good thing to have. I'm saying the math says, welcome to the land of you're not going to have a choice because of your legal obligations, the only way to pay them.
Charles asks, if we modernize systems in the state, won't we save money? That's something we've talked about over the years. I mean, some of the state systems are not, as we know, very modern. Some of them have been modernized in the last 5 or 10 years.
Sure, and we absolutely will. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do. It's literally just what's going to change the scope of the problem. That's like saying, you've got to get rid of a tree stump in the backyard and I hand you a penknife and say, go out and get at it. and you scrape at the tree stump for 2 hours. You haven't made the problem worse. You have made it marginally better. It's worth doing, maybe, but it'll improve services much more than it will save money.
Is there consideration, Eleanor asks, of having people continue to work at home in an effort to save money and consolidate work in state buildings? Now, this is interesting, Keith. When you talked about, say, Yukon, if kids don't ever want to go back to school in the same way they did, well, that's going to be a problem for a Yukon. But if the state said, maybe we can change the way we work post COVID, I don't know. Is that a way to save some money, sell off some state buildings? I don't know.
I do think you're going to see that simply because people don't want their staff getting sick in large numbers at one time. And I think people have also been pleasantly surprised at how much productivity has either maintained or grown during the pandemic. Again, small numbers. There are only a few tools that can deal with the scope of the problem we have. It's not that these are bad ideas, but it's like you've got 4 feet of water in your basement and somebody says, I have a really good Dixie cup and I want to help you deal with the problem. It's good that you want to help, but you're not bringing the right tool to this problem.
So John asks something that a few people have asked some version of. So Keith, what would be your top 3 fiscal and budget priorities for the state? And in your view, what are the best solutions for each of these? I mean, obviously you're not running for governor or anything.
Right.
I mean, what would you do to help solve some of these problems?
I always say, John, I am running for governor. It's at notachanceinhell.com.gov and .org. No, I mean, obviously as a journalist, I can't tell you necessarily what the state should do. I will tell you what the math would suggest, though. Our pension debt, whenever we don't restructure it and kick it down the road and grow it, unfortunately has been growing many years faster than our economy grows. So what do you do when your problems are growing faster than your economy? Ultimately, the only way you can do it is you're forced to choose between all bad choices. All these things will weaken your economy. Putting off the debt until it gets so big that Wall Street won't even let you borrow money cheaply is not the solution either. At some point, you have to look at the big revenue engines and say, we have to start paying down this debt. And I will point out, we have more than 3.25 times the per capita pension debt of the average state. Most other states don't have the problem anywhere close that the Connecticut has. New Jersey commissioned a study last year, basically, what can we learn not to behave like Connecticut? And that's New Jersey, I'll point out.
But a lot of
Sorry, listeners from New Jersey.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure we've got a lot of them. But as you say that, Keith, an awful lot of people would say, look, if you turn on those big revenue engines in order to solve the problem, that is going to cripple the state's economy. I mean, it's not going to be competitive. And it's not just about rich people leaving. It's about, in many people's minds, truly crippling the job creation in the state. Is that a concern?
You're talking about a long, slow haul, but I would present to you that we're going through a long, slow decline right now. We're still basically, it's like one more analogy. It's like going to the dentist after not brushing for 30 years and say, I will only listen to pain-free solutions because I need something. There's no such thing as a fun root canal. It's an oxymoron.
There's a headline for you. Alan asks, will minimum wage continue to go up or will they hit pause on that?
I think that will continue to go up. With the Democrats in the majority, I don't see any way heading into another election cycle they would hit pause on that.
Nathaniel wonders, can't we restructure our pension obligations like Rhode Island did?
No, and I'm glad, that's a great question. There was a great New York Times article, but I think most people read the headline. This was several years ago, and about what Governor Raimondo did, and they didn't read the article. Rhode Island promised almost all of their benefits only statutorily. So they had a lot more leverage in court. Connecticut promises its state employees their pension and their retirement health care via contract. Teachers, we've got bond covenants. We've promised our investors that we will make our payments. I have yet to find anyone who can even show me legal research that says that we can get out of these payments.
Howard asks, what percentage of annual Connecticut tax revenues come from the DeLeon Cohen families? What percentage of annual revenues come from Fairfield County? I don't know if you know all those numbers off the top of your head, but the larger point is, how much do we rely on Fairfield County and some of the people with names like that to pay an awful lot of our bill.
Right. I couldn't speak to the tax obligations of a particular family, but absolutely, in terms of a roughly $10 billion income tax stream, the majority of that money, without a doubt, comes from Fairfield County. Keep in mind too, think of it also this way: instead of just dividing it geographically, about 2/3 of the income tax comes from paycheck withholding, and about 1/3 from quarterly filings, which are like, capital gains, dividends. But there are other sources of income that are filed quarterly, but those are the biggest ones. If you're in the lower brackets, you might get less than 10% of your income from investment earnings. When you get to our top income brackets, they're between 75 and 80% of their money comes from these sources, which will show you why a proposal for a capital gains tax is so controversial.
Fred asks, is there a way to increase funding level of the pilot program? That's payment in lieu of taxes, folks. The state has come to nowhere near meeting its obligations. It seems a higher level of pilot payments, he writes, would go a long way toward helping communities and taxpayers that are under stress.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is, by the way, where Senator Looney wants to rechannel money. He wants to put it into the pilot program. Hartford officials said that was one of the biggest problems that pushed that city, not into bankruptcy, but into the threat of bankruptcy. It will also come down to whether or not Governor Lamont wants to be flexible with the state spending cap. You might need to legally exceed the cap to put more money into pilot, because the pension money is beginning soon to come under the cap, and it's going to start squeezing space even tighter.
A last question for you comes from Willis, and it goes back to the beginning of our conversation. And we've talked about this in some way, Keith, but I'll read what he writes. Thank you, Mr. Phaneuf, and he'll refer to your November 9th article, Connecticut's extreme inequality poses major obstacle to sustainable inclusive growth. This is part of a big inclusive growth series that we did on the Connecticut Mirror. And he'd like to share your concerns from the article, if there's anything in this year's legislative budget to address any of the systemic inequities in Connecticut. Because I think, Keith, a lot of what happens when we talk about the budget is we talk about, well, money coming in, money going out. Are we going to tax the rich to pay for long-term obligations or things that senators and representatives want to do this year? The thing that you were trying to address in that article is just the enormous inequities that we have here in the state that are as systemic as the problems presented by a $92 billion long-term debt obligation. So maybe you could address that a little bit. Is there anything that's being talked about right now at the Capitol to really get into those big problems?
Okay, I feel bad because I'm going to end on a down note, but John, what else have I done? The short answer is, so far right now, there's not a lot. And I think the best way I can defend that prediction is to ask you just to recall back to the summer. There was a special legislative session. It was largely in response to the tragic death of George Floyd. The legislative leaders came out, and particularly in the Senate, and they proposed a very aggressive agenda. And they felt, with the support from the Black Lives Matter movement, like they were really going to make progress. And ultimately, it was all watered down to, I almost feel bad saying, only a police accountability measure. But here's my point. The fiscal note on that was $1.5 million. Now, if you and I had that, we'd say $1.5 million. That sounds great. I was doing a little furious calculating here while John was talking. $1.5 million is 133rd of 1% of the state budget. In other words, we were happy to say these things matter to us, provided they don't cost us money. If you want to make improvements in these areas, you're talking about money. Right now, all the money's going into the pensions, and I don't think anyone's going to let us stop doing that. So if you don't identify more money, you have to put aside those goals. And I'm sorry to give you that blunt of an answer.
Well, so maybe we want to end on such a down note. Keith, the governor's budget address has been pushed back from its normal perch a week, I believe, right? It's on the 10th of February coming
Correct.
up. Do you expect anything unusual, different? Will there be any surprises from Ned Lamont and his administration in this year's budget?
I think there will always be some surprises, but we are still largely constrained by our pension debt. It's been a long time since we've gotten something where it was what the average taxpayer would call a good surprise. I don't think you're going to see anything too big in terms. You'll see some more money for higher education. I think that's certain. I think you'll see some efforts to help out the cities and towns. We'll keep trying to modestly improve education funding. I think that's about the best you can hope for.
Keith Phaneuf covers the state budget for the Connecticut Mirror. He is, although I have the beard for it, he is the Gandalf of the Connecticut state budget. If you want to continue this conversation with him on Twitter, he's at CTMirror Keith. He loves to mix it up on Twitter. If you have any questions for him that we did not get to tonight, Keith, thanks so much, and happy budget year.
Happy budget year, John. Let's keep doing this.